Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. Just if you haven't noticed, we'll be recording this session to be put up on the intranet later. It's the first time I've ever been recorded, so bear with me if I get a bit shaky, but it should be fine. But because of that, I think it'll be easier if we save questions for the end. It might be a little bit hard for the recording to actually to capture the questions and the answers in the way that they probably should be. So if that's okay, my session will generally run for about 45 minutes and then I've left 15 minutes at the end for questions. So perhaps take a note of any questions you might have along the way. I'm happy to refer back to sections when we get to the end. Okay, so this session, it's a session that I've been doing for a number of years. I'm aware that a number of you will be here because you are potentially going to be involved in, say, fence calls, processes like that, around the transition. This session is a bit broader than that. It's around winning jobs in government. We talked about and thought about how we might modify that for the specifics of the transition arrangements we're going through. But in the end, we came to the conclusion that a lot of this stuff's really quite useful. And it probably would have been a wasted opportunity not to sort of go through how the ideas and concepts around winning a job in government in full. So we'll do that, and where it's necessary to or useful to, I'll talk specifically about what might need to be done in terms of fence calls, etc., around the rejuvenation. So in terms of this presentation, keeping in mind that all agencies, including DIPTI, have their own specific processes. So I'll talk about what I call the traditional processes around selection, merit selection in government, but watch out for the variations on the theme. Always read the eligibility criteria and the process requirements for jobs you're applying for, and speak with a nominated contact person who's associated with that job. As I move through, sorry, I haven't got a clicker. Have we got a clicker? Otherwise, I'll just use this. Is it that one? I could just use that. Okay, just forgive me, I'll have to step across and change the slides as I go. From experience, this presentation is a little bit dry to start, so bear with me. The good stuff's more towards the end, so but the stuff up front's also important. So just let me, if you don't mind working with me, we'll work through it. So as I mentioned, many of the processes, the processes we might be going through around rejuvenation are probably going to be modified or abbreviated rather than full merit selection processes that you might normally associate with government. So I'll touch on that as we go. We'll talk about some different tips and techniques. Some of these views, most of these views, I hope, are generally held by the HR fraternity. Some of them are more my ideas and my experiences, and so if I'm going off in a bit of a kooky direction, that's probably when we're getting into my ideas, and that's fine too. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward in terms of where you look for and find jobs in government. It's fairly self-explanatory. Jobs SA, that's the old notice of vacancies that most of you will be aware of. There's a link there that you can use if you like. There's also the DIPTI intranet, Seek, local newspapers, etc. When you're involved in a fenced call through a rejuvenation restructure type process, you'd be contacted specifically, so you don't have to look for that. That information would be provided to you. That's not an exhaustive list, by the way. LinkedIn is another source of jobs which has been more and more commonly used, and there's a bit of discussion and exploration across government at the moment about perhaps expanding our use of LinkedIn as a source of attracting talent where we're looking for talent outside. But again, that doesn't necessarily apply in a restructure situation. All right, the definition of merit. Now, again, this is a bit dry, but this is important. This is what you're trying to prove and articulate when you apply for a job, and it's what the panel are trying to determine. So it's really important to understand, and I will read, I'm not going to read slides as I go through, but I will read this one. The extent to which each applicant has abilities, aptitude, skills, qualifications, knowledge and experience and personal qualities relevant to carrying out these duties. The key words there in bold, to the extent to which and the relevance of those skills, experience, qualities, etc. are important, and that's what you'll need to be focusing on, and that's what I'll talk about as we go through. We use merit for two reasons really: to make sure that people are being assessed against a consistent benchmark. So it comes down to fairness. When you're applying for a job, you should have a reasonable expectation that you're applying against a consistent benchmark, and it ensures that applicants are judged fairly based on their skills, experience, etc. So that's basically the concept of merit, that anyone who's running a selection panel is obliged to make sure that they apply as they go along. At this point, I'd usually ask questions, but we'll save that, or ask 4 questions, but we'll save that for the end. Okay, again, not necessarily so relevant if you're doing a fenced call for the rejuvenation, because you will be potentially deemed in scope and be involved in a selection process, without having to go and find it. But when you're looking for jobs in government, when we're talking about general career progression, when we're talking about applying for jobs, moving up in our careers, however you want to put it, think about, is the job for you? It's important to be realistic. A lot of people tend to take the scattergun approach when they're applying for jobs. They have one CV or resume and they send it out for multiple jobs, different skill bases, different levels, thinking that might be the best way to get a job in terms of saturation. My experience is it's better to really focus on the jobs that you think you can win. It's also, you get a better chance of winning those, which is better for your confidence in the end as well, because if you do the scattergun approach, you tend to have a much lower success rate, and that eventually starts to wear you down, and we'll talk about those sort of concepts as we go through. Just while we're on this slide still, just keeping in mind that it's about, you start with requesting the job description, job and person specification, role description, whatever it might be called, whatever's available to describe the role. You need to do some research about the employer and the strategic goals of that employer. The employer, in terms of a selection process, I would think about it in terms of the business unit first, then the division, then the organisation, and you'd want to have an understanding at those sort of 3 levels in terms of having a background understanding of the job you're applying for. And the strategic goals are going to be unique to the organisation that you're in. So a very simple example, I've been with DIPTI for a year, I came from education. The strategic goals of education are around educating children. The strategic goals of DIPTI are not that. They are obviously quite different. So a basic understanding of what the organisation is that you're going to apply for, and do that bit of research. Then do an evaluation about whether you might realistically be a good fit, and then go from there. Target jobs you can win, and then give it your best shot from there. All right, so I'm going to talk about applying for jobs. And I'm going to talk about it in terms of a traditional format. And as I've said, there are plenty of variations on that. So the traditional format for applying for a job in government has been a cover letter, a statement addressing the criteria, what we might call the application, and a resume or a CV. Watch out for the variations. Some agencies have word limits, some even some subsets of agents. Within an agency you might have a particular process that has a word limit, so watch out for word limits. Sometimes, and more, agencies are asking for a CV and a cover letter and no application. Watch out for that. Don't spend your time on an application if it's not required. Sometimes they might even want a CV alone, particularly for a fence call. That might simply be a CV, or it might simply be an expression of interest. So watch out for the variations. The other variations are sometimes they ask for a full application, as in addressing could be up to 8 criteria, for example. Sometimes they might just pick a couple. So just watch out for those. And the other thing in terms of applying for a job is you get e-recruitment processes where you're applying online. So often they won't have a cover letter, for example, because they'll ask you to complete that online. And sometimes you have to fill out, with e-recruitment you tend to have to fill out the whole application online. So watch out for that as well. Now you'll see up here that I've got the resume/CV, and Ali will talk about this more later and might have a better understanding of this than me. So I'll admit at this point that there might be differences between what we say, and that's just going to come with the territory, and that's worth exploring. I'm going to hang around afterwards, happy to participate in debate. But as a general rule, a resume is a shorter, brief summary, no more than 2 pages about your career, and a CV is more in depth. So the resume is the one that you tend to use to have that immediate impact, to sell yourself, working on the assumption that people on panels have short attention spans. Resume is the one that you would tend to use. Now, that said, in my experience, people use those two terms interchangeably and don't necessarily know the difference. So I don't think it's necessarily a big deal, but I do get asked that question reasonably often. So that's the general definition. The other thing is that a resume will generally be modified for each job you apply for, whereas a CV is usually the document, say, that sits behind that would probably be more stable, and you wouldn't necessarily change or change as much anyway. All right, the cover letter's pretty straightforward. It's about introducing yourself. I won't go through each dot point of the slide, but just one point on the cover letter. If you are doing a full application, when you're applying for a job, keep the cover letter really brief. It really is a very brief introduction, so people can open up the pack and know who it's from, who it's to and who it's from. If they've just asked for a cover letter and a CV or a resume, I tend to beef up the cover letter a bit with a bit more detail and might push it out from, say, 1 page to 2 pages. That's the arbitrary sort of figures, but I'd put a bit more detail in the cover letter if I'm not doing an application. But you would never, under any circumstances, want your cover letter to be more than 2 pages, would be my view. Okay, now Ali's going to spend quite a bit of time for the group in the room afterwards talking about resumes, but for the purposes of the recording today, I'll go into it a little bit now too. So the resume I've touched on a little bit. It's a history of your relevant experience, skills and qualifications. It provides a quick reference about you. An interesting point in doing some research for this presentation a while back, a private sector study, quite a recent one, suggests that panel members spend less than 2 minutes looking at each resume. Now, my experience in government is that it would probably be a bit more than that because of our obligations around merit. But it's a worthwhile note to think about, point to think about, because panels you don't know necessarily how many applications they're looking at. I've been on panels where I've had 90 applications. So you have to keep it punchy, I guess, to the point, really concise. It's an opportunity to sell yourself, and you don't want. I try to imagine myself in the chair of the person on the panel going through 50 applications or whatever it might be, and they see a really dense, long CV and think, oh gosh, I've got to read through all of that. Try and present it in a way that's going to be really punchy and concise and make it attractive to the person that's reading it. And that's not to say that you can't do a longer one, but my preference is focus on the last 5 to 7 years of your career. Experience that's older than that tends to be considered a bit less relevant. Keep it to, certainly the resume, keep it to about 2 pages, and make sure you're tailoring the resume each time you use it for a different job. So a very simple example, if I've got a description of the last job that I had in some dot points, and the 2 dot points at the bottom are actually, of my current version, are actually the most relevant to the job I'm applying for, I switch them around and I stick them at the top, if that makes sense. So it's small things like that, but it's also more fundamental things that you might do to change your resume. Obviously, you're still the same person with the same experience, but it's always worthwhile tailoring your resume as much as you can to match that job. Now, one of the other things we see a lot in CVs are the use of subjective terms or cliches that don't really mean much. Words like results-driven, think outside the box, team player, hard worker, detail-oriented, they don't really mean a lot. It's really important to focus on actual results. That's what people want to read about and want to know about. Words like improved, trained, created, resolved, influenced, they're the sort of words I'm talking about, and I know Ali will go into that in a lot more detail later. But try to use those sort of active words to describe what you've done. And this seems simple, but it is often an issue. Make sure that your referees are recent, they're relevant in terms of the job that you're applying for, and they know that you've applied for the job. It's really, really important that referees are... So when I apply for a job, I let my referees know, I send them a copy of the job description for the job I've applied for and a copy of my application. They may or may not read it, but it gives them the chance to be prepared to answer those questions and have a sense of what I've said and what I've talked about. It's really important. So I will drill down every now and then through this presentation to some really basic stuff, because people tend to come undone on that stuff quite a lot. All right, the statement addressing the criteria. It's becoming less common, so more and more we're going with CVs and cover letters, for example, almost extinct in the private sector as I understand it. But it is still worth exploring, because there's a lot of information that I can convey through talking about the statement addressing the criteria that also influences and flows onto interviews. So I do want to spend a bit of time on it. So where you are going through a traditional selection process in government, you'll be asked to write an application. And that's addressing specific criteria from a job description, role statement, whatever it's called at that particular moment. And that will be used along with your CV to determine whether you get an interview. So it's very important. They can take a lot of time and effort, especially in their full form, when you're addressing up to 8 criteria. It wasn't that long ago that you could have 20 criteria in those things, but that generally has been resolved in the public sector these days, and it's really more than 8. But even that leads to an application that's probably at least 4 pages long, if not a bit longer, and requires quite a bit of work. But they are really useful, and they're important, they're useful, and they make the interview stage easier because they basically act as your preparation. So that's where you do all your research and you're thinking about what you want to talk about. Keeping in mind that you're addressing the essential minimum requirements of that job. Drill down to some basics again. Spelling and grammar. Have your applications proofread and allow enough time to have your applications proofread. Seems really simple. I'm on a lot of panels, I see a lot of applications, I see a lot of spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes. It sends a real message to the panel, particularly when you're an unknown quantity, that that person lacks attention to detail. Now that may or may not be true. There might be a whole lot of reasons why your application wasn't proofread, but it's a really important thing to consider. So keep the small things in mind as well as the big. And make sure that you're really across and you know the closing date for the job. So often people come back and say, I thought it closed next week, or can I put in a late application? Often you can put in a late application, but you're still then known as the person that put in the late application. That's not necessarily going to have a negative impact, but I'd prefer not to be that person if it were me. Think about those sort of things. And as I said, I reference this stuff because people get it wrong all the time. So it's really important. All right, so when we are writing a written application in government, we're demonstrating that we meet the criteria of the job by describing our skills and providing recent and relevant examples and achievements. This is, in terms of writing applications, the biggest issue of all is the way that people write examples or the way that people define an example. I still think that more than half of the applications that I read in my work don't include any examples at all. And I think it's genuinely because people don't really know what an example is. An example is an experience you have had, an outcome you have achieved, a project you have contributed to, or a piece of work you have produced. It is not, I communicate with people in the workplace every day, or I order stationery every day, which is what often people might say. Has anyone heard of the acronym STAR? Yeah, so a few people. STAR stands for Situation, Task, Action, Result. And it's a really useful, it's old, it's been around for a long time, but it's really useful in guiding the way that you put together examples. Situation, it basically sets the scene. A task, what was to be achieved, what was the goal. Action, what did you do? And result, what was the outcome? It's got to be an outcome, and it's got to be a happy ending, really. If you're really clever, you can provide an example that had an unhappy ending and explore why. And I have done that because it can give you certain insights into your thinking, into how you conducted a process. And the fact is, not everything we do is successful. But as a rule, I'd stick with the stories with a happy ending, if it were me. Now, this is a really key point as well. So we're using examples, but we're using examples that are relevant to the role. That's another issue that we see a lot of. So someone might provide an example, but then you think, but how is that relevant? How is that relevant to this job? So think about and you can tailor, you can use an example from a previous application, for example, that may not necessarily be specifically relevant, but you can tinker with it and you can tailor it so it actually does make some links back to the job you're applying for. You want the panel to envisage you in the role. When they're reading the narrative that you're creating in your application, they want to see this person understands this work, this person has transferable skills for this work, and they might just be a fit. So think about that. So you want examples that are relevant, and you want examples that are at the level of the role as well. So a very simple example, a job description for an executive and a job description for an ASO 1, both might have a criteria around communication. I can tell you right now the answer that they're looking for is not the same. So make sure that your example that you're providing captures the level of complexity commensurate with the role. It's a classic mistake. If you're an ASO 2 and you're applying for an ASO 3, the trick is to provide an ASO 3 level response. One of the mantras we have in HR is a perfect ASO 2 application doesn't win you an ASO 3. You've got to actually, that's the trick. You actually have to be able to provide examples that demonstrate that you actually have the ability at the level you're applying for. So that's the key to winning promotional jobs. The narrative of the example needs to align with the context and the complexity of the job. So I think that I've covered that. One other thing, in terms of the balance of your application, often you tend to have word limits, and even if you don't have a word limit, you have a real obligation to be concise. So each word is very valuable to me in an application. Be careful using whole slabs of text and paragraphs relating to demonstrating your personality, your values, your personal beliefs, your theoretical knowledge. That's not irrelevant, but I would do it in the context of an example where possible. And so what we often get is applications that are what I would say is out of balance. The examples are thin, or they don't have enough detail, and then there is whole slabs of information where people are demonstrating their personal values, their theoretical knowledge, those sort of things. So remember, examples equal evidence. And good examples will demonstrate the application of research and personal values. But just come back to the example, build it in and around the example, because you do those. To me, the guts of the application are the examples, and the personality, values, personal beliefs, theoretical knowledge are the third dimension. They're important, but they're secondary. So you build them in, but you don't build the application around that. Does that make sense? It's about balance, and I'll come back to that. At this point I would ask questions, but we'll just keep going. Okay, the interview. Good preparation for an interview goes a long way to offsetting nerves. I think people tend to feel a bit isolated in terms of how nervous they get around doing a job interview. And I really want to try and put that to bed. Everyone who does an interview is extremely nervous. Now, granted, some people have different degrees, I would expect, but I've been on panels from ASO 1s to executives, very senior executives, and I can tell you, they all get nervous. Their voices shake, they forget what they were saying, they go blank. It happens to everyone. So it's, and I take comfort in that, and I hope other people do as well. But what makes you really nervous is when you get into the interview and you realise you're not prepared. So good preparation is the best way to offset nerves. Never going to get rid of them, but it will help. It's really, really important to be prepared. But I've also found that you can be over-prepared. Now this is where we're going off on a personal tangent of mine. In my experience, I have over-prepared for interviews, and it's led me to be so full of information that I'm ready to spew out at the panel that I'm not listening, I'm not engaging in conversation, I'm not reading social cues, I'm too busy just getting all of that information out of my head. So my opinion is that you can over-prepare. The way I deal with that is I do my preparation leading up to the interview. I don't do any the night before, and I just do a quick refresher in the morning. That tends to keep enough space in my head to engage in a conversation. That's my technique, you'll have your own. But my experience is over preparation can be as bad as under. So obtain some information about the position in the organisation. So you want to go in there sounding like you've done your research. Business plans, annual reports, organisational charts, relevant legislation, anything you think might be relevant. If you're a suitable candidate for the role, if you genuinely are, you probably have a sense of what a lot of those things are. Refresh on your application. This is where your application really comes in handy. All of the answers are in there. There's no need for you to come up with new examples in the interview. You can trot out the examples you used in your application, and if they're your best examples, then that's what you should be using, in my opinion. Anticipate the interview questions. This is another one that I don't think people realise how easily you can do it, or to what level you can anticipate interview questions. The interview questions will come from the job description, the guts of them. You know, there are broader questions. You know, why do you want the job, etc., etc. But and you can predict those to some extent as well. But the core questions will come from the job description. So you'll know what they're going to ask you about to a degree. My experience is, or my recommendation is, that you prepare your 4 or 5 best examples that you've thought about, you've put into your application hopefully, that cover off on multiple criteria. So very simply, if you have a really detailed example that relates to communication, say, communication in the workplace, that same example can be used potentially for conflict, it can be used for teamwork question, it can be used for any number of other questions. So to keep my head not overflowing with information, I like to have prepared my 4 or 5 best examples that I think cover off on all the criteria, and then be ready to talk about those. And most of the time, I've got most of the questions covered. You can't. There's no guarantees, but and then what you need to do is bring yourself some prompt notes, which I'll talk about a little bit more as we go on. And keeping in mind, when we're in an interview, we still use the same STAR methodology. Describe the situation, what was the task, what was the action, what was the result. Same the way you would have written it in your application, you'll speak about it in the interview. And aside too, you can't control the questions. And my experience is that panels don't put enough time and thought into the questions sometimes. And sometimes the questions don't allow you to necessarily say what you want to say or what you think you should say. So you don't have a lot of control over that sometimes, but try and find ways of working around, while answering the question, but working around to getting your best examples out there. You have to try and be as flexible as you can there. Sometimes you get to the end of the questions and you think they weren't good questions. First thing you do is you doubt yourself. You think, I just didn't do well. But then after you've done it a few times, you think those were pretty poor questions. But those same poor questions are going to your competition as well. So the way you handle them will be important. And I try to bring them back to my best examples. Just another comment in terms of mindset about career progression, because I think people tend to think career progression is something that comes up every couple of years when you think it's time for a promotion or an opportunity presents itself. And I think we need to change our headset a little bit around that. We really need to be thinking about our own personal brand and our own personal reputation at all times when we're at work. I mean, to me, every interaction, every task, every piece of work is a job interview. I think it's really, really important to be thinking in those sort of terms, because that's where our reputation comes from. That feeds then into referees, who start to build a higher and higher sort of view of you, or a better and better view of you, and then that feeds back into the selection process. So career progression is something that you should be thinking about all the time, if that is what you aspire to, of course, which not everybody does. Okay, what do we take to an interview? I talked about prompt notes. Keep them simple. No slabs of... my personal opinion, I can't have slabs of text in front of me. Panels don't want to see you reading from a sheet. I can't envisage a scenario where that's ever a good look. So I think because it's not a conversation when you're reading off a page. So prompt notes for me are a couple of words, dot points on a page in front of me. I've got my 5 best examples. It might say difficult client example, something that will trigger me to know what that example is. A couple of words, because one of the things that everyone worries about in interviews is going blank. Obviously, we all have the capacity to do that. Pressure does strange things to you. With those prompt notes, I'm confident that I won't go blank, and accordingly I don't, generally. So they help. Just a trigger for when that empty space comes into your head, glance down, recover yourself 3 seconds and off you go, because you've got your prompt notes there. They're really handy and useful, but keep them really, really short, just as a trigger. Really simple thing, but I tend to always take with me, we've done our research when we're doing the application, the strategic plans, etc. for the department that you're applying for the job. I bring those with me and I set them out in front of me. It's just a visual thing. It's just to say to the panel, look, I've done my research. Hopefully you can actually speak to some of it too. But I think it's a small thing, but sometimes it's the small things that help. I'm going to drill down to some basics again now though, because again, these things tend to be issues all the time. Make sure you arrive on time. Make sure you switch off your phone. The reason that the basics go wrong is because people are under pressure and they're nervous, and that's when they forget simple things. Dress appropriately. An interview is a formal professional interaction. I'll talk a little bit more about the formality of interviews as we go along, but don't underestimate the formality of an interview process. And some people do that. People that haven't interviewed for a long time tend to go in, can have a tendency to go in a bit too casual. Careful with your language, careful with the way you dress. It's a formal occasion. You've got to be yourself, but you've got to be the formal version of yourself. And a friendly and positive approach. This process isn't about likability, but the way you interact and connect with people is important. And it helps if you can make connections. I don't know about you, but I've been into interviews and I've just thought, these just aren't my kind of people, or I don't feel a connection. You've got to try. You've got to try and find that connection. Again, it's a peripheral thing. It's not a decision-making point as such, but it's something to think about. Okay, so we're in the interview. Remember, it's a conversation. I touched on this before from my own experience of over-preparation and not engaging in a conversation. Listen, be attentive to all of the panel members. Really, it's fascinating being on a lot of panels and seeing what people do when they're under pressure. They will often eye one person and talk to one person the whole time. It's a nervous thing, they don't realise they're doing it, but the panel do notice. So try and be attentive to all the panel members. The simple thing is, when they're doing questions, they usually take it in turns. The panel usually take it in turns asking questions. Perhaps talk to the person that asked the question. But make sure you keep your eyes sort of darting across all of them and don't just focus on one. Ask questions. People often don't ask questions. They answer questions in interviews, but they don't ask. Curiosity can be a very attractive quality, I think. So definitely be willing to ask questions. Consider the social cues and try and create a level of rapport. These are all small peripheral things, but they do help and they all do make up a package. Avoid making negative statements. Again, I say it because it happens more often than you would think. Negative statements about yourself, negative statements about your employer, negative statements about your clients. It's never ever a good look. And so many people will come in and make negative or derogatory statements, either about themselves, not so much about the clients, but themselves or the current employer. Because the fact is, sometimes people are leaving a job because they don't like where they are and they don't like the people they're with. But that's not information to share in an interview. So be really careful to avoid that. I want to talk a little bit about I statements versus we statements. And by that I mean, so for example, I implemented a change, I completed this project, or we implemented a change and we implemented this project. So this is often an issue. Again, it's about balance. I think, broadly speaking, focus on the I statements. This is about you after all, but think about the balance. The people that focus too much on the I statements, that can come off potentially as don't know if arrogant's the right word, but that's, you get where I'm coming from, I suppose. But it's about, it can sound like you're claiming credit for other people's work, because we all know that with projects, there tends to be more than just you involved. There's other people involved. So get the message right. But the people that come into an interview and they bit more self-deprecating or whatever it might be, and to talk about we did this and we did that and we did that, it's very hard to then identify what actually their role might have been and what they've actually achieved. So get the balance right. Think about selling yourself, but it's nice to come across as having humility and being inclusive and giving credit to others as well. It's about sort of creating a broader picture. Remember, you don't need to pretend that you know it all. I think a lot of people, not just in interviews, but in their careers in general, get around with this concept that they're expected to have all the answers, and so they have a front that they do. I don't think that that's necessary either in your normal day-to-day work or in an interview. I find people that are willing to talk about what they do know as much as what they don't know is probably quite refreshing. You just need to be the best candidate. You don't need to be the perfect candidate. It's not about, it's always about who you're up against, I suppose, and whether you're suitable for the job, but you don't need to know it all. And I like to be pretty honest with that stuff. At the same time, you can talk about how you understand it, how you might do it if you haven't done it before, but you don't have to pretend you've done things that you haven't. Just be clear about what you've personally achieved and describe the broader outcomes you've contributed to. And use your examples, which we've talked about. Now, non-verbal communication. We'll stay on this slide for a minute. Normally this is a bit of Q&A, but I'll just push through. Simple things again: eye contact, friendly, enthusiastic, engaging. Think about the tone of your voice and the speed of your speech. We're under pressure in an interview. That does strange things to you. It affects the pitch of your voice. It affects, for me, I talk way too fast. I think I'm talking way too fast now. But, think about those things. Slow your speech down. Think about your pitch. Don't click your pen, which is the other thing that I do all the time, and that's why I've got this thing in my hand. Little things like that, they make a difference. You will be nervous, and people won't hold that against you so much, but just think about how you're presenting overall, and try not to give that impression. Try to give the impression that you're as sort of in the zone as possible, if that makes sense. I talked about not being too casual in terms of your interactions. It's really important. Get the level of formality right. Some people, I think, feel like this is me, I need to present me. But you can be, my view is you can be just a slightly more formal version of you. Keep the slang out of the interview room altogether. Certainly the profanity, but even the slang. And I think that applies for any job at any time. So keep that in mind. Confidentiality in your examples. So I've talked to you about using really specific examples, but keep in mind, depending on what your work is, there's things in there that are not appropriate to share. So you need to think about how you present that information. It doesn't mean you can't use the examples, it just means that you've got to make sure you leave out the names and the identifying information, etc. So think about confidentiality, it's very important. Honesty. Your referees will bring you undone every time if you overstretch. So you can sell yourself, you can create you can think about what you've done and present it in the most positive light. Everyone should be doing that. But don't push it too far. Think about what your referees are going to say. Humour. Humour can be a brilliant way to create rapport, but it can also be try it at your own peril, is my experience. If you drop a joke and it doesn't really work, and you misread your audience, it can get a bit awkward. So keeping in mind that sometimes you're the 12th person for the day, and these people have had a pretty grueling day doing interviews, and they might not find your joke funny. But if you can pull it off, by all means, you back yourself. And end on a positive note. The interview, this is another thing. The interview isn't over when the questions are over. Often, you get to the end of an interview, the chairperson will then say to you, do you have anything else to add? And people will say no, or they'll say, when can I start? Or they'll say, how much do I get paid? It's actually an opportunity there that's just been opened up to you to sell yourself. my simple view is the panel will have an idea about what they want and what they think is in the job, but you will have an idea about why you're the best person for the job. And inevitably, you will have thought of some things that they haven't. That's when you get to talk about that stuff. So I go into an interview with, in front of me in my prompt notes, some ideas about why I think I'm the best person for the job. If I haven't talked about any of those things during the course of the interview, I get them in at the end. I make sure I get them in at the end. Because that way, even if I didn't get the questions I want, even if I didn't give the best account of myself for those questions, I got an opportunity to get a whole bunch of information in at the end. It's a second chance. So use that end of the interview to actually sell yourself and hopefully seal the deal. But keep it succinct and relevant, and try not to repeat the stuff you've said during the course of the conversation. How are we going for time? How long have I been going?
We've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay. Feedback. Whether you're successful or not, ask for feedback. If you do win the job, ask for feedback. Bask in the glory, you've earned it. Ask for feedback, and there might be some things you can learn. You wouldn't have been perfect. It will always be worthwhile. If you don't win it, feedback is all the more critical. Feedback can be really hard to swallow. And I say that from bitter personal experience. But whatever you do, don't argue or seem defensive. It's a really important part of the process. Applying for jobs, seeking career advancement is a humbling experience. And I think we should all embrace that. It's not a bad thing to be humble, it's not a bad thing to be humbled. I'm not saying don't be angry when we don't get a job, by all means, but just pick your forum for expressing that. Take in the feedback, use what you can, reject what you don't agree with. There will always be feedback you don't agree with, and that's fine, but there might be some pearls of wisdom in there as well. There might be some stuff that's really useful. And whatever you do, do everything you can to remain calm and measured. It's a powerful conversation. If you can convey humility and goodwill in that conversation, it keeps a door open in the future. I think you've got to think about your career as a long game. You're not going to win every job you apply for. Nobody does that, unless you don't apply for many jobs. So you want a person to get off the phone thinking they'd be happy to work with you in the future. You want to keep that door open. And remember too, in government, we will often have second, third, fourth preferred candidates for a job. So if you're not the preferred candidate, they offer the job to somebody else, that person might not accept the job, or they might do it for 3 months and then leave. In government, they have the opportunity to go back to the second preferred candidate down the track. You don't want to have given the chairperson a mouthful because you weren't the preferred candidate when they're thinking about whether they might come back and get you. I've got 2 jobs in my career by being the second preferred candidate and them coming back to me later. So think about that. It does happen. Yeah, I think that's about it for that section. And just some final thoughts. As a rule, I think people have more control over these sort of processes than they might think. Ultimately, it is out of your control, I understand that, but there are a whole lot of elements and moving parts that you can control and influence. Hopefully I've covered off on all of those today. And my view is you need to control all of the elements that you can to give yourself the best chance. And then you succeed or you fail. And then you move on. You know, that's my philosophy. Some key things to consider in summary. Focus on jobs you can win rather than casting the broadest net. Be thorough in your research and preparation. More importantly, be more thorough than your competition. And I use the word competition intentionally because I think it's a bit of a dirty word sometimes in government, but these processes are competitive. It is a competitive process and you need to think about it in those terms. And the way to win those is to be the best prepared and the best person for the job. Sometimes you can be better prepared than somebody, but they've got a better skill base than you. But it's never a bad idea to be the best prepared. Project yourself into the role. So prepare an application and a presentation at interview that sound like they have been created for that job. There is nothing more difficult difficult's the wrong word. When you're on a panel and you get an application and you read it and you think, this person is clearly putting the same application around for 10 different jobs. They haven't thought about this job. They haven't written it for this job. It clearly is just a generic document. That's not a great look. Not to say it wouldn't get you an interview depending on the content, but make it look like it was prepared for the job. Make it look like you really want that job so much that you would actually write an application for it, rather than you wouldn't mind that job, so you chucked in an application. You want to look like the person that really wants it. And is a really good fit. Provide examples at the level of the role. I gave you the example of the communication criteria in an exec role and an ASO2. Make sure you're pitching at the right level. Present a well-rounded picture of yourself as a person and a professional. Build your presentation around examples. Don't be afraid to give insight into your personality and personal values. Create that balanced message. Remember, these people are making a decision about spending a significant proportion of their time with you over the next however many years. Think about it in those terms. There is a lot more depth to this process than sometimes people give credit for. Persist. You're not going to win every job you apply for. And if you're an ambitious person and you're applying for a lot of jobs, my view would be that your ratio of your success rate is probably going to drop off even further. But it doesn't matter. It's not about winning every job. It's just about winning enough that you get where you want to go. Success doesn't come from winning every job you apply for. It comes from good preparation, research, refining your application and interview skills, and persistence. If you do that, you'll get there eventually. And it's easy to say, but we've all been there. Don't let the knocks stop you pursuing your career. The people that stop pursuing their goals in their career are the ones that haven't coped necessarily as well with the rejections. You've got to try and find a way of coping with that rejection and getting something positive out of it, which is easier said than done. Nobody wins every job they apply for, but if you're successful and open to feedback, if you're open to feedback and you're persistent, you'll be successful. That's it.